Is there any sort of direct or indirect link in which melanin can benefit people's immune system health?
Basically, building up the melanin would be tied to higher amounts of like bioenergetic potential, I would say. And
Would it be pretty fair to say that if you see like acne or aging or seborrheic dermatitis, they can often like infer that there is internal mitochondrial issues going on, things like redox issues, that sort of stuff?
yeah, I mean, the skin within itself, like arguably the first two layers, they're very energy demanding. But I literally just bought an iPad just to take notes because I just think laptops are a trap.
All right, what is going on, everyone? We got our incredible guest here today, Jack Schroder, and he is an absolute legend in the holistic health space. He's pretty big on X, Instagram, etc. And to just kick off everything, Jack, I wanted to know, like, what's the origin story here? Like, how did you first and foremost become more convinced that mitochondrial health is just a central part of healing that most people neglect?
All right, well, thanks for having me, fellas. And that's a great first question. So, yeah, I think like anyone else probably here, I think you guys were the same in terms of going through your own health issues before finding out that, okay, well, I need to heal myself first. And then after that, you start to understand even deeper layers in terms of what health optimization essentially encompasses. And did you want me to go through like the whole story around that? Or do you want me to
Yeah,
jump straight to mitochondria?
yeah,
I
let's
think
hear
it's
the whole
good to
story.
understand someone's sort of ethos and evolution.
Okay, cool. So much like probably you guys as well, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit before the call that my health stemmed from a lot of like drug and alcohol use, especially from like the ages of 16 to probably around 25, 26. So there was 10 years of definitely doing some damage, and that doesn't include other things like constant video games, pornography, eating like shit, all the classic um 1990s kids, what they went through, I suppose. Think not really being aware of like how bad this stuff is for our health. Um, and yeah, it was definitely like a lot of that. And I didn't think I felt it. Like I felt pretty invincible up until about 23, 24, 25. And then I suppose it started to hit me like a ton of bricks, especially around like the COVID time. So I'm not sure if COVID and the pandemic was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it just happened to be a bit of a coincidence that like my health started to deteriorate at that age at around 25. And I was just thinking, okay, wow, what's going on here? So I went and got some blood tests and my testosterone was like ridiculously low. I think it would have been in US numbers, I think it was like 200 or 150 or something like that.
Oh
It
boy.
was, yeah, it was really low. And then like my free T was also really low. I didn't test anything else around hormones, but then looking back at my labs now, like there was just a lot of shit wrong with it, to tell you the truth, beyond that. But that's the one that I definitely gravitated towards, like the testosterone being lower end. And because I suppose it's just like a marker of your male vitality. So, and that's exactly how I felt. So like definitely felt like low libido, constant anxiety, low energy, gut issues, low motivation and drive. And I would just escape. Like I would escape with like going on my phone constantly. Again, every weekend it would just be drugs and alcohol. Every day it would just be like 3 to 5 cups of coffee. It would just be like constant stimulation and constant escape, really. And I think also on top of that, I would say that I haven't been diagnosed, but I would say like I'm prone to like ADHD tendencies. So I think that within itself as well further fuels like me just like chasing the stimulation constantly, which yeah, obviously is a big thing in the modern world. But anyway, I had a few other things like some mild sleep apnea, which is probably something that I'm still slowly starting to resolve, but it's definitely made like a lot of traction. But ultimately, I think the biggest thing that made me shift away, like, or taking health into my own hands, was when I spoke to an endocrinologist and he saw my testosterone and I kind of asked him, I think I asked him, like, do you think diet, sleep, um, like exercise is playing a role here, like, or like drugs, alcohol? And he just said, but mind you, he was like fat, bald, pale, not like not the epitome of like someone who should have like should be an endocrinologist. They should have like someone you look up to who has like T of like 900 plus or something. Anyway, he just said no, not really. Like this is sometimes just how it is. And then yeah, exactly right. So I just
Ridiculous.
thought, well, there must be more to this. And then Yeah, I suppose I stopped drinking and doing like and partying. Like I kind of just went cold turkey after a few other incidents that happened. Like I broke my wrist after running away from the police during like COVID times, which was like during a party. And then there was a few other incidents that happened. And then I just thought, okay, well, it's time to pull my head in. Like I shouldn't be feeling like this at this age. This is just fucking pathetic. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people in the health space is they just hit a wall and they're like, okay, now I'm actually ready to change. I'm ready to like adapt the growth mindset and be more open-minded. And that's exactly what happened. And yeah, I just started to get little breadcrumbs, maybe on like, social media, also just reading a few books about like circadian health. And then eventually it just like evolved into starting to go deeper into like the biochemistry. I'm like, okay, well, what's this mitochondria thing? Like this thing seems pretty interesting. And I think the first person that I learned about the mitochondria from was actually someone called Morley Robbins. I don't know if you know him. I don't agree with like everything he has to say, but he did present like the mitochondria in a way that like, okay, well, energy metabolism essentially runs everything in our body. And whether he looked at it more from like the mineral lens, but ultimately like it's still the same terminology, I suppose. It's just like a different language of speaking about it compared to like light or inflammation or whatever terms you want to use. It's all pretty relative, and I suppose that's the most important part, right? That like energy is essentially what governs life, and if we have no energy and we have more exhaust, which is aka inflammation, then we're definitely going to be not running optimally. So it just essentially like this is probably about 2.5 years, 3 years ago now, even longer, where I started to really dive deep into all this stuff, all these topics. And I think it's just obviously, as you guys know, as you research, you start learning more and more and more. You're like, wow, like the body is just so amazing and complex in the most beautiful ways. But I managed to get my health to a really good level. In fact, I just tested my testosterone last week and it was at 900, which I'm pretty happy about.
Now
And
we're talking. Let's go.
yeah, I still got to test my DHT though, because I don't know what that's at. That would be
Yeah, we're gonna
interesting to.
get that to like
You could,
100. Oh yeah.
ah, that'd be the goal. But yeah, and then I just so I was working my old job, and then I decided to um, I wanted to help other people, and I think during COVID, where like I felt really restricted in my job, just being like I had to live in this certain place, but I felt like this ambition just to like travel the world and work online. That was like my dream, and yeah, I'm slowly living that dream to tell you the truth. Like it's been probably 2.5 years of while I was living out of a little backpack with like, a like very minimalist lifestyle where I was like literally packing, what would it be, like 15 pounds worth of clothes and laptop and everything else in between. But yeah, and then since then I've just been building up the business and learning a lot about myself and just what I want out of life and everything in between. So yeah, here I am today, as of December 2025 in the Philippines for the last 8 months, I think. So yeah, it's been really beautiful being here. I met an amazing woman here, so I think my life is going to be set up here for the time being, definitely.
That's awesome, man. It's really interesting hearing other people that are in the space and providing education and hearing their stories because I find so many synonymous aspects to people's evolution and sort of their education should you sort of break that initial barrier, which is sort of just like escaping the system. And I relate to you, like one of my early diagnoses when I was 25 and I was already in the middle of my autoimmunity stuff was I discovered I had hypogonadism. Like you actually beat me. My total T was 111 and my free T was 11.4. And they put me on testosterone replacement. And it was a relatively high dose. I'd have to shoot up like every week or something like that. And they couldn't get my number above 250. And my sex hormone binding globulin also remained really high. So after about about a month and a half of doing supplemental T with my endocrinologist, I just stopped because I was like, it's not even doing the numbers job, let alone I feel literally the same. So that's sort of like where I went on my own again. And that's kind of where like all these numbers seem to drive together. But when it comes to mitochondrial health, what's really interesting about it, as you keep diving deeper, and I feel like we're only really scratching the surface in so many ways, especially when it comes to like biophoton emissions and things like that. Like there's so much more work to be done that never ends. But a lot of people think of mitochondria as sort of that overarching powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy factory, but it's actually like this much larger picture. I mean, they communicate when other mitochondria lag, other mitochondria pick up the slack, and they're taking in all these cues as sensors from our innate environment around us, not just internally through food and various things like that. So I'd love to ask you, how does and mitochondria act as an environmental sensor as we integrate things like light, nutrients, oxygen, and also stress. And how does that dictate our overall health?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. So yeah, I suppose with the mitochondria, yeah, I think you've already summarized it quite beautifully here around its interactions in terms of picking up the slack from other ones, communicating on like not just like a mitochondrial to mitochondrial level, but cell to cell level, tissue to tissue level. I think there's a lot of that stuff going on like the quantum scale in terms of communication of shuttling energy and information throughout the system, and that's going to look like through water networks and microtubules and through melanin and other semiconductors and fascia and everything else in between. And I suppose like with researching that, there's a lot of amazing like hypotheses around it, and there's also like a lot of unknowns. But I'll tell you what I think is going on based off what I've researched. So in terms of like the environmental sensor side of things. So firstly, I suppose like the biggest consideration is like there's all these pathways that obviously lead into the mitochondria. We've got the TCA cycle, we've got anapolarisis, catapolarisis, we've got amino acids feeding in, we've got fatty acids coming in, we've got glucose coming in, many things are happening. And now I would say like the biggest thing that is going to dictate what is going to go on within our cells, within our tissues, is ultimately how oxygen gets reduced at cytochrome C oxidase. So that would be the make or break in terms of obviously everything that sort of builds up to that, and what essentially happens at that step will govern life as we know it, because ultimately that's where oxygen is getting reduced with the electrons being fed through. And as we know, like oxygen is the most electronegative or second most electronegative. I know that fluoride is first or second. I forgot. I think oxygen is most electronegative. Could be the second. Anyway, so electrons flow through and it gets reduced to water. And that water is obviously very important within itself. It is deuterium depleted, and it plays a very fundamental role within the mitochondria and arguably throughout the cell. And again, it ties into these water networks for quantum coherence. So I would say like anything that compromises that step, whether it's like a nutrient deficiency, for example, maybe it's coenzyme Q10, maybe it's riboflavin, maybe it is vitamin B3, maybe it's like a antioxidant based molecule, maybe it's glutathione or thyrodoxin or something like that. Anything that essentially compromises the reduction of oxygen is going to govern the pulses of free radicals and the biophoton emissions that come with it, and also the energy versus exhaust, where energy reflects, well, on the biochemical level, it reflects ATP, and then the exhaust will reflect reactive oxygen and nitrogen species, which then again, like when they get neutralized and reduced, they will shoot out certain wavelengths of biophoton emissions. So that's the nutrient side, I suppose. Like any sort of nutrient defect or bottleneck in the TCA cycle, electron transport chain, or any of these pathways has the ability to compromise what goes on at cytochrome C oxidase. So that would be one thing. And then I suppose the other things from like an environmental standpoint is, yeah, any sort of stress. And again, like the mechanisms are a bit murky, but like any sort of stress, whether it's environmental, whether it's psychological, whether it's psychosocial, whether it's light stress, whether it's nutrient stress, as we mentioned before, all of them through various mechanisms will have the potential to either compromise what goes on at that step or anything in between. And then at the same time, it also has the potential to induce something called like the cell danger response. And I'm sure you guys know about the cell danger response, where a cell perceives a threat and it will protect itself, or more so, it will protect the rest of the system by putting itself in this biological state where it cannot really be used or run coherently with the rest of the body. And usually that will start to have like a bit of a domino effect. And that stress, as I said before, it could be anything. It could be a toxin. It could be any sort of nutrient stress, mental stress. I think like that's a big thing as well. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that oxygen is compromised. And then, as we know, that like oxygen is a double-edged sword. We need it. We can't live without it. As you know, like if you try to put a plastic bag over yourself, you'll die very quickly. But you obviously have something called oxidative stress, and that's the dance that we have to make. That we want to make energy, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we are not using. We are still. So, for example, if we can't run that system properly, we're trying to make this dance of like, okay, how much exhaust can we get away with? How much inflammation can we get away with while still making energy? And as we get into a position of becoming unhealthy, where obviously the energy output is relevant to the exhaust is like dropped. So it's not like obviously energy is high, exhaust is low. And arguably, I think it's like 1 to 3% of that energy should be exhaust. It's probably going to be looking more like I'm just guessing here, but like 70%, 30% or something like that. And obviously that's going to be like have huge implications. So what we do as a protective mechanism is we enter a state of hypoxia or like the cell danger response. They all kind of tie in with one another. And we see things like hypoxia inducible factor alpha 1 or 1 alpha, sorry, where that will increase. And that shifts how the metabolic state of the cells work. And that's how oxygen, it somewhat protects us from excessive oxygen. And what essentially happens is like we become less efficient to try and make up for the excess exhaust that we are making. So we're kind of just getting by. And that you see that with most humans. We are just getting by, running at like 30 to 50% of our full capacity. But it's protecting us. And you obviously see that on many levels. But I'm probably diverting here around from your question. But essentially, like mitochondria, that's what dictates what they do, basically. And anything that builds up to that step, whether, again, it's like some sort of stressful stimuli where you're in like this sympathetic state, you're breathing through your mouth. Obviously that adjusts to oxygen tensions in terms of what's going on in the body. And obviously when that's chronic, we start to see things like with what chronic mouth breathing, like nasal passages are clogged up. We start seeing like our actual posture is shift towards a state where we run only breathing a certain amount of oxygen. We see that with like sleep apnea, where like we stop breathing at night to protect us. So again, like there's so many things that would just influence it from a stress standpoint, but it all comes down to that step and anything that's kind of tied to it.
I love that. I love that. I want to nerd out on hypoxia a little bit more. You laid that out all super well, but just for our audience, like at a cellular level, when we get this chronic low-grade hypoxia, how do like certain modern lifestyle factors, even like indoor lighting, artificial light, pollution, how does this sort of stuff create this state of hypoxia, even when we are breathing fine in a sense?
Yeah. So, and I suppose like the interesting thing is, right, that like the more energy you make, the more oxygen becomes utilized just because of the nature of the ATPase spinning, and oxygen is paramagnetic, so it's going to be drawn to it. So obviously the faster that goes, it's kind of like working in a positive feedback loop with oxygen. So I would say the first thing, like one of the biggest considerations is just like your light environment. And as you can see here, like I'm outside. I don't know if you guys can notice, but I'm always outside just because of the fact I know how beneficial infrared light is, because it allows for the ATPase in the mitochondria, so the step after complex 4, cytochrome C oxidase, to spin like at extremely efficient rates. And that within itself is like such a huge antidote towards hypoxia, and actually allowing oxygen to be reduced properly and making sufficient energy and exhaust. But then there's other considerations as well, right? So again, it kind of ties back to what I said, like any sort of stress will induce hypoxia. Like even there's research around just like a fear, like the feeling of fear like stem from like a thought or like some sort of stimuli, that within itself has a potential to induce hypoxia. We see it in like cancer models where hypoxia is elevated like to ridiculous heights, and that's probably more so around the actual system becoming so dysregulated. But it's kind of like protective in a way in that sense, because as we said, like with sleep apnea, it's kind of similar pathology or biochemistry, should I say, where hypoxia is protective, and it's protecting the cancer in this case, because of when you have more oxygen, there's more chance for oxidative stress. And when there's more oxidative stress, there's more chance for apoptosis, essentially, in cell death. So you do get a bit of that going on. But essentially hypoxia, it's going to be coupled to certain intermediates in the TCA cycle, where like if there's bottlenecks there. So for example, when alpha ketoglutarate is elevated, actually inhibits hypoxia. But then when succinate's elevated, which is kind of tied to, well, it is tied to not only the TCA cycle, but also complex 2 in the mitochondria, which again, that, you know, it kind of links those two together. And when that builds up, we see increases in hypoxia. So, and that within itself, like seeing high levels of those are going to reflect any sort of like stress on the body, whether it's like, again, metabolic, nutrient, any sort of stress will compromise what goes on with those steps. And those steps have the potential to drive biochemical reactions that essentially increase hypoxia in our cells. So what it's trying to do is think of it like this. It's trying to protect you in certain ways. As I said before, it's protecting you from further damage in a certain way. So the body's just trying to do the best it can with the fuel it has, or should I say the fuel that it can actually utilize, and that being oxygen in this case.
You know, what's so fascinating about everything you just said on one hand of it is just sort of the nature of how nature doesn't make mistakes. There's that famous sort of, I don't know if it was Jack Cruz who said it first or whoever said it first, and the other idea of nature doesn't create waste. And so a lot of people, like, for example, like when I was learning about the electron transport chain really, really roughly in like biology in college, I remember them talking about water being a waste product, basically. And so it's sort of confusing when you look at how everything else in nature sort of has a cyclical nature of growth, abundance, die off, and that die off, rejuvenates the soil, and then it like goes back and everything's cyclical. So it's weird that we would perceive our own biology in a way of, oh, this is simply just a waste product. Or it's similar to like an organ system, like the appendix. Oh, the appendix doesn't do anything. You don't need it. And now we know it's like this reservoir for all of your like amazing gut bacteria. And so there are these things that I feel like we make these definitive actions on because it's easy to sort of make a decision in a black and white view of the world, but none of that is actually the case. It's all like in this gray area. And one thing that I think you made really pointed at that's important around that is around light and the importance of light with ATP synthase and that sort of tunneling and all these things. You mentioned being outside, getting red infrared light. It's one of my favorite things to do. How would you say that light environment in which we now live, and you stress a lot in your own work the importance of getting sunrise, midday, sunset, the different arrays of light throughout the day as well, and full darkness at night. How does disrupting our circadian biology and all those clock genes through modern lighting throw off mitochondrial function from the get-go of our day for most people?
Yeah, that's probably something I didn't mention as well. I mentioned like the whole infrared light thing and being outside, but then I didn't talk about the opposite end of that spectrum of being in isolated artificial light, submerged non-native EMFs, where those two within themselves induce hypoxia as well through many mechanisms. But yeah, obviously, I would say like the biggest thing around the being inside, and I probably didn't mention this earlier as well, but like being in an indoor environment. The air, like the circulation of air is not as good. Those are other things to consider on top. But yeah, I would say the biggest thing around being in an artificial environment is probably like the lack of infrared light. And then closely next to that would probably be the lack of like UVA and UVB light. And then right next to that would probably be just like every other balanced color that's found within like sunlight, being green, purple, orange, red, and yellow. But yeah, so I suppose like your question was around like
sort
the
of
light
like
phases.
Yeah, the question was how being in a very limited spectra environment, starting out at the beginning of our day, which is where you would naturally in nature see sunrise and getting all those proper circadian signals into the ganglion cells in the retina and then melanopsin going to the SCN and things like that. How does setting that up immediately by just looking at this or turning on the bathroom light or opening your fridge, how does that set up the entire system for that day already behind or at failure to some degree?
Yeah. Okay. So let's use phone as an example, because I'd say like the majority of the population is waking up and going on their phone straight away. And majority of people are using it without a screen filter. And they're obviously connected to the Wi-Fi. They're usually going to be checking their phone and doom scrolling. So within that, I mean, like even just like the dopamine side of things of that and just like getting like this huge pulse of just like stimulation at the start of the day, it just sets you up for failure basically, where you prime your mind and body for short-term attention span, right? Especially if it's like just like doom scrolling, looking through reels. You've got this, okay, you've automatically set your attention span to a maximum of like 5 to 7 seconds for the rest of the day basically. And even within that, like dopamine is meant to be pretty high in the morning. Melatonin somewhat acts as like dopamine kind of acts as like the off switch for melatonin through like the D2 dopamine receptors. So you'd think that if there is this chronic stimulation of dopamine in that case, you're going to get like this depletion across the board, like, and obviously just these random spikes. So within itself, you're going to have like this huge circadian disruption from the get-go, where melatonin may not be completely wiped out, but it's at that level where you've obviously slept, and you have this sense of just like grogginess, as opposed to, okay, I need to have more deep sleep here. And so you're in between that, and then like, oh, I've got all this energy to start my day, and I feel really motivated. So that would be the biggest thing, just like throughout, just this, like, just the stimulation of that. And that's probably arguably without even like light influencing that. It's just like how these applications are engineered. But going back to what you were saying predominantly about light, if there is no screen filter, you're going to have like this sorry, there's like a chicken in the background going off. I don't know if you guys can hear it. This is just the life here in the Philippines. So like with that phone, you have like the setting on it, like it's going to be like the color temperature of 6,500 Kelvin, more or less. It's probably going to be like anywhere between like 5.5 and 6.5. And what that fundamentally means is like the color temperature of 12 p.m. noon without UV and beneficial UV and infrared light. One sec, I just got to sort out this chicken. Do you mind giving me a second?
Yeah, you're good. You're good. That's the beauty of editing.
Yeah, sorry. So what I was saying was, yeah, with the screen, it's going to prime the body, okay, that it's midday, and you've just skipped like, I suppose if you look at it from that angle, where we should realistically be rising and falling with the sun in terms of like our biology, and you've kind of just jumped straight to 12 p.m. where you suspect that you need to be really alert, because ancestrally that was the time where we're meant to be really alert. And that within itself, I think, just like further adds fuel to the fire in terms of like how you're feeling emotionally, and then, yeah, I would say like if you're lacking the infrared light and the UV, or predominantly the infrared light in the morning, you're not getting like this clean this clean reduction of oxygen in the mitochondria from the get-go. And most people are not outside at all. They're not grounding as well, which is, again, works like perfect with the sunrise, because you're going to get infrared light, you're going to be grounding, which is going to provide electrons to the system, which for like, it does help like with reducing oxidative stress. It helps with increasing blood flow and increasing the zeta potential of red blood cells. It feeds electrons directly through your fascia, probably into like the mitochondria directly, which again is obviously very beneficial within itself. And you're just obviously just going to have more of a net negative charge, which is, again, something really beneficial in the modern world. So, doing those things, and then arguably I was like the third pillar around that is like doing some sort of like breath work where you're doing CO2 retention, where that within itself will help with like oxygen release, because of the Bohr effect. But anyway, so like if someone is just waking up, they're checking their phone, and then they go and start their day, and they're probably just like, I don't know, maybe they go for a walk, and if they don't, then like they're just inside, windows are closed, they're not getting any sort of light stimulation of infrared or beneficial UV wavelengths, which I could get into in terms of all their benefits, but basically they're all essential within their, every wavelength is essential for many reasons. And there's arguably probably a lot we don't know in terms of like what these wavelengths are actually doing beyond like, increasing hormones, increasing neurotransmitters, increasing nitric oxide and blood flow, increasing like the photoelectric effect, so feeding energy into the system. But yeah, I suppose like the biggest thing is that this constant blue light exposure, and again, without the UV and infrared, which have like these balancing properties to the blue light, and the the infrared has balancing properties to the UV, hence why it's never found in isolation. But what essentially happens is if we get blue light exposure constantly, especially like on our skin and eyes, we have photoreceptors there called melanopsin, and these melanopsin receptors detect blue light. And essentially what happens is it's bound to vitamin A, and then DHA is found not too far between that, and essentially it sends like this electrical signal from light. And when this photoreceptor gets constant stimulation, and we don't have like the other wavelengths that kind of regenerate it, and then also if we don't have darkness at night, we don't regenerate it either. So we have this constant blue light hitting and landing on this 480 nanometer blue light receptor. And what essentially happens is that this blue light, like the whole feedback loop of that is completely backwards. Vitamin A essentially just becomes liberated, and it's never recycled properly through the visual cycle. Then it turns into an aldehyde. So this is actually where like the anti-vitamin A people have some truth to what they're saying, but it's just like not about food. It's about light in this case, and that's like a reactive aldehyde. And we know that aldehydes are very destructive to cell membranes, not just like and also mitochondrial membranes and proteins and lipids and everything in between. And if we're getting that constant stimulation there from that, or like constant um, abundance of that molecule, just in excess, we're just driving excessive inflammation, and it acts almost as a signal where mitochondrial dysfunction also kicks in. And again, like we don't have the infrared light and the UV to kind of support that. And then I think the biggest consideration as well, one of the biggest considerations, is like these photoreceptors found in our skin, our arteries, or our blood vessels, our fat, and also our retina, and even our brain as well. They just lose the signal basically. So we cannot detect what is going on anymore from blue light, and that's actually not a good thing, because blue light is actually really beneficial when it's out in nature. It helps like cleave POMC in the right direction towards ACTH and cortisol. And then within that, it leads into two like really important brain regions from the retina. So the retina relays through like the retinohypothalamic tract, which is like a myelin-rich tract that has two stops. It has one stop in the hypothalamus at the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then that communicates with other regions of the hypothalamus. It communicates to the brainstem, the thalamus, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord, and everything in between. But essentially, we know that the nervous system is running the whole show basically. So what we get is like this huge confusion about like what is going on in our environment, where it's just like this constant blue, no sunlight, no darkness, and that's one of the regions, and that's obviously tied to hormones, the autonomic nervous system. So again, like think about like what that is and what that encompasses. Like that is literally like how we like our fight or flight versus our rest and digest. And if there's confusion, inflammation there, it's going to inhibit vagal tone and raise sympathetic tone, which again has so many considerations around blood pressure rising, inhibiting motility, inhibiting bile acid production and liver detoxification, inhibiting kidney detoxification, and like actual removal of toxins, and everything in between: vasoconstriction, poor blood flow, inability to get an erection, premature ejaculation. I could just keep going, but basically like that shift is just huge. And then the other region that it relays to, so obviously your eyes detect the light, sends the signal down, and it needs to be obviously again sunlight and like natural light versus artificial light. But it also detours or makes another stop at the habenular nucleus, which is found right next to the thalamus, right adjacent to it, and that relays up to your frontal lobes. And any sort of defects around there, around that, like through excessive artificial light and inflammation and oxidative stress, will knock out how the frontal lobes work. And if you guys know what the frontal lobes do, I mean, I'm predominantly talking here about like the prefrontal cortex in this case, but there's obviously other regions that work up there. But that's going to be tied to decision making, judgment, awareness, like focus and attention. So again, like that within itself, any sort of blue light and oxidative stress within that region shifts the way you think. And I think that's like a really big deal, because obviously in the modern world, we see all this bullshit that is just going on every single day. And then we just can't think for ourselves anymore. And the easiest thing to shift the way our perception of what we think life encompasses and what we think is like differentiate from wrong and right, is essentially just from what our input is. And it's usually just going to be social media. It's going to be all the bullshit on there. It's going to be the news. It's going to be what our government says to us. And then that within itself like shapes you to just be like this puppet basically. Anyway, that was like a long spiel, but
yeah. And if you did not hear that right, please go back and listen to that, because what Jack just said is extremely important. If you separate yourself from nature, not only are you setting yourself up to be brainwashed in a way, but you're also setting up all of these natural physiological systems in your body to slowly decline over time. And what we want in life is we want to live a long, happy life where we have vital life and we're filled with energy. We feel good. And then we die fast in our sleep. But the way that modernity has us set up in a way is so that we're just going to die this slow death where our health is declining over many, many years. And if we just make that decision to say, hey, I'm going to get outside more and I'm going to return to what every other animal in nature is doing, aka just being outdoors and receiving the right light environment, the right inputs from nature, it can make a very big impact on your life. I wanted to ask though, like from when you started in your health journey and you began optimizing yourself, what would you say are like some of the most noticeable differences between when you started and where you are now health wise?
Yeah, good question, man. I would say like, yeah, the biggest things I would say like the just from like the physical symptom standpoint, my gut is definitely a lot better than what it was. I never did like a proper antimicrobial phase or gut protocol, but I just know that there was definitely something going on there. Like probably, I suspect it was like SIBO or yeast or arguably both, to tell you the truth. So like just to have no issues with digestion almost whatsoever, unless I eat like a dodgy meal in the Philippines, which can honestly happen every now and then if they've left out the food for too long. But yeah, I would say like the gut stuff is obviously huge, but like probably more so from like the emotional level. Um, yeah, like I think you were on the money like around being exposed to nature and optimizing your health. Your purpose, I feel like, is just rolled out to you on a red carpet where you just know exactly what you need to do on this planet. You can call bullshit when you see it. You can think for yourself. And I would say like the other thing is just like on a spiritual level, I just noticed that the more I become coherent like within myself, I think, and obviously that like ties to health, I think you become more coherent with the universe in certain like ways that we probably can't explain, and I don't think we'll ever will. But you just start getting it's almost like you every time you are in like a state of like maybe it's meditation or like a deep breath work session, but then at the same time also just like doing stuff that's like what you resonate with and what you align with, you are almost like uploading like part of like your thoughts or like your spiritual being up into the universe, where you get all these fragments of like synchronicities and really amazing opportunities that sort of come your way. And I would say like that's the biggest thing where, yeah, I don't know, it's just you start seeing certain colors or like certain numbers or just certain amazing things just happen in your life, and you're just like, wow, like this never really happened to me before. And I think this is why people who start getting healthy, like they start understanding like an idea of like what God is. So that was something where I was just like not religious whatsoever, and I'm not like I don't have like a religion per se, but I know there's like a God, and that was something that I was just like completely like against and just didn't believe in for so many years. And I suppose again it kind of circles back to what we're saying, where why would we want to believe in God where we just see all these extremists on the media of like religions going against each other? And obviously I would say like that within itself, um, like seeing that and then also just being like really controlled, and you think that it's like a bad thing. And I think like God and the universe is like our sense of faith and hope through the tough times. And that's something that I think was probably the biggest change for me, is like being a lot more open minded to that. I'd say if the other things is, and this is something that I've probably only just started, like I'm working on continuously, but just like being able to have like really deep work, minimizing everything in my life that I don't need, um, just being really productive, but also not being productive in the sense where I'm like working excessively, but just like being really strategic with my time. And yeah, I suppose like that is like from a motivational standpoint, and just again like having the focus there and everything in between. I would say like my memory has definitely got a lot better as well. Especially when you're not doing like alcohol and drugs every weekend, you definitely notice like improvements around that. And yeah, I would say like physically as well. It seems like effortless just to like stay jacked and build muscle. Um, it's just like great to be honest. Like, so yeah, I would say like they're probably the biggest things. And then I suppose like from a symptom standpoint, like as you said, I don't know how you worded it, but when you fall asleep, you something about like dying fast when you fall asleep or something, where you just like fall asleep really quick. Yeah, I just seem to have that as like I always had that as a superpower, but now even more so. Um, and yeah, just like waking up like without failure, no alarm, just always at like sunrise or within like 30 minutes of it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And actually, it's funny because I feel like everyone that goes on this journey sort of has a similar philosophical growth pattern, as far as like, you don't just learn about physiological principles, but it also takes you through a journey, like through your soul. And what's funny about it is you observe the world differently. And so what you realize about yourself is that in a world where you're programmed and made to be addicted to social platforms, addicted to food, addicted to expectation of what society puts on you, in a sense, in sort of the traditional way, you sort of wake up one day and realize that not many of your thoughts growing up or through, high school, college, academia were really your thoughts at all. Not much of your actions were actually definitive actions that you made, that you thought out. They were all sort of, in a way, pre-selected, and then you selected from what the array was given to you, but you weren't really thinking through those things. And so it's fascinating having conversations with just friends or family that are not plugged in like us, and seeing how they perceive the world, because it's a completely different way than you and I would have just talked about being a human animal in space. Like, it's just a completely different perception. But kind of diving back into things, one of the most exciting discussions, or sort of rabbit holes, that I went down in my circadian journey was about melanin. And actually, I got the honor of interviewing at one point Solis Herrera, who wrote a really good book on melanin. It's a little bit difficult to follow. I had to like go through a couple times because it's translated from Spanish. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
It's good. But for people that maybe aren't so aware, and people that are in our side of the internet, they hear us talk about all the time. Many of us talk about melanin production and how it's tied directly to mitochondrial signals and light input. But could you explain how melanin isn't just simply this thing that results when we go out into the summer sun and we get UVB light and our skin gets a darker hue? Could you explain how melanin really is important and crucial for bioenergetics and redox balance and neuroprotection as well? And when you look at neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, you actually see, for example, neuromelanin in the brain or the brainstem, you see it break down. And so, and they're starting to see other things in other psychiatric disorders around melanin breakdown and neuromelanin as well. So all of this is sort of a interesting question. Now, I know that's sort of two different things, but we'll go back to like the EU melanin, FEO melanin stuff first before like taking on neuromelanin.
Yeah. Something that I haven't actually researched it for a while now, but yeah, I would say like just on that point around like melanin breaking down, and the fact that, again, UV light, mostly UVB, but also UVA, is needed to essentially like renovate it constantly on a daily basis. And I would say like that's a really big consideration just around like the UV side of things, beyond just like vitamin D, nitric oxide, and everything else that it does, is to constantly like light up POMC in a fashion where alpha MSH is made, and then that alpha MSH will obviously do a bunch of cool things, like, induce libido, which again kind of makes sense around like the sunlight side of things, but a very potent anti-inflammatory. And I find it really interesting that, like, I know this is a little bit off topic, but like a lot of the peptides are acting on like alpha MSH. I just find that really, really interesting. And then obviously it has like appetite suppressing effects, but one of the main things is it will induce pigmentation through the MC1 receptor, the melanocortin-1 receptor. And the interesting thing is, so if we start all the way back to when we were a baby, I found it just really interesting. And I think this within itself makes you just shift the way of like what melanin essentially is. That why is it being made 4 to 6 weeks in to being in the mother's womb? I just find that really interesting, and I have like some suspicions of what's going on with that. And I suppose we can just outline that now, where melanin has been studied even by like huge corporations like NASA as like a really powerful semiconductor. And you're just like thinking, wow, like that's pretty incredible. And you got to think of like the properties of melanin. I mean, it's like this, it can form these huge sheets and like these polymers of essentially like tyrosine and phenylalanine derivatives that, go through certain reactions to actually form melanin, and they can all just like attach together and be found in certain regions within the cell. Arguably, I would say my research that I've done, it's found, I've seen that it's like melanosomes form near the mitochondria. And then I imagine it's found in other places as well. Obviously, we know it's found like around the nucleus, and it will protect the nucleus through its, like, I think they're called supranuclear caps or something like that, where the melanin essentially forms and kind of protects the nucleus from UV damage because the DNA absorbs UV light directly. But then you got to think, okay, so if it's doing that and it's a black color, obviously that's why it will give, like, the more you get, the darker you become. And that's what we see, like, in the span of, like, Africans versus white people, where you you think, like, okay, so it's absorbing light, but then what the fuck is it doing with it? That's what I always was wondering. Like, what is it, just like it absorbs it and then just dissipates it all as heat? Like, it just doesn't really make that much sense to me that, like, we have something like that, and we've done, like, so much research around, like, other chromophores in the body, and this one just seems to be like the greatest of all time in terms of, like, what it can do. So yeah, it's interesting in that sense. And then, as I said, like, with the research, it's a very powerful semiconductor. So, and what semiconductors essentially can do is they are able to modulate electrical circuits and have holes and like additional electrons, I forgot what it's called, but then they have the holes as well, and that essentially creates this current. But then at the same time, like, melanin is also, like, very electron rich, especially when you're, got high redox and you're grounding and doing all the beneficial things, and arguably getting sunlight as well for, like, the photoelectric effect. But that within itself creates this huge reservoir of, like, electrons that kind of work in with water networks as well, and it has, like, a really huge reducing capacity where it can essentially reduce basically all forms of free radicals. So hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, peroxynitrate, and I believe even, like, the hydroxyl radical as well, and lipid peroxides and everything in between. So you got to think, like, this melanin thing's pretty cool. And then I suppose the other thing is, like, we've sort of evolved to have no hair as well, and I'm always, like, wondering what's going on with that. And I would say that, like, we've definitely learnt, like, if we sort of correlate that with, like, our primates, where they're obviously, physically stronger, but not mentally as advanced as us in many ways, like through the way that we're able to speak and comprehend stuff and, create fucking ChatGPT and all this crazy shit. And what's wild about it is that the so the melanin, where was I with that? So with the melanin, we have essentially internalized it in our organs and things of that nature to essentially be able to leverage it for its abilities, like with semiconductors, for its semiconductive abilities to reduce oxidative stress and everything in between. And even beyond that, it's known to be like a heavy metal chelator as well, which is pretty incredible. Arguably, it can bind to toxins. I've read research that it can actually bind certain, like, metals in the 2+ state, like, not just like even just cation metals like zinc and things of that nature, to actually control self signaling. And like, it can get really complex, and I think there's, like, a lot of unknowns around it. But ultimately, like, going back to your point, you said that, like, melanin can degrade, and, like, it can be depleted under oxidative stress and hypoxia. And what I think is going on, and I probably didn't mention this earlier, but I was sort of honing in on it, is that when we're in states of hypoxia, we're obviously in a state where we need less energy, and we're going to be downgrading our body, like our biology, in certain ways to essentially match to that level of how much oxygen gets reduced and how much energy we make. And I think that's what happens, where we see, again, like, people with, like, hunched over shoulders, or, like, mouth breathing and everything in between. And then I think, like, it also ties in with, like, the fascia, where, like, that's water and collagen networks and microtubules in the cytoskeleton, where I think we see, like, downgrades around that as well. And that's where you start seeing, like, joint pain and, like, tightness in certain areas, because we're literally trying to stop energy from flowing because we just can't handle the amount. And I would say, like, that's what goes on with melanin as well, where melanin will degrade and not be synthesized properly. And again, like, melanin production is oxygen dependent as well. There's for example, like, there's a few hydroxylase steps, and we also need, like, hydrogen peroxide in the right amounts. But what I think is going on is that melanin is degrading intentionally to essentially allow us to be it's degrading, like, all the semiconductors are degrading, including melanin, to make it relevant to the energy that we can allow in the system and the oxygen that we can utilize. So yeah, like it is really interesting. I think there's also another thing around melanin where its dielectric constant. I've found research that it's around 1000 if it's hydrated by water. And I imagine that water is deuterium depleted. And the dielectric constant is like how much electromagnetic energy we can store. So, think of it like as a capacitor, not only as a semiconductor. And just for reference around that, like deuterium depleted coherent water, like charged up by infrared light, is only dielectric constant of 160. So I think it's like this reservoir of energy. And when we don't need it or we don't want it because of our body like not being able to utilize oxygen for all the stresses that we mentioned at the start, I believe that like the whole system just essentially downgrades. And that's where we see diseases, because at the end of the day, all disease really is, like, we can think of it as like mitochondrial dysfunction, which is kind of like a synonym for an energy insufficiency, realistically, and exhaust in excess amounts. I think that's what's going on the biophysical level, where energy and information isn't sent through the system coherently or efficiently no longer because it's not safe to do so.
Yeah, that was very well said. That was just absolutely awesome. Um, I know in my journey, like getting more tan, getting that melanin, it has been so important for my health. And for those that don't necessarily know, I had all of these immune system issues going on, like all these mast cell things, sensitivities to practically everything. And I noticed that the more melanin I would get and the more consistent I was with that, the better things seem to move. So we obviously know that like post COVID, there is a very big and very large increase in those who are experiencing issues in their immune systems. Is there any sort of direct or indirect link in which melanin can benefit people's immune system health?
Yeah, I would say like, I would say like the biggest thing would be basically building up the melanin would be tied to higher amounts of like bioenergetic potential, I would say, and more reduction power. And that's something that I didn't mention is like it controls the fidelity of like biophoton signals within the cell. So like it's obviously absorbing light externally, but it's also absorbing light like from the like biophoton emissions, whether that's from like mitochondrial metabolism or any sort of reaction, usually involving oxygen, where it's actually controlling the signal. And if we kind of circle back to what I was saying earlier, and I might not have touched on this too in depth, but like biophotons, like, again, the research is not 100% clear, but I would suspect, just like due to the efficiency of what light essentially is, like biophotons is what is governing light, life and signaling as we know it. We just don't know it yet. So melanin is playing a really big role around that. So, if you are building up your melanin, yeah, I would say like it's going to be really beneficial for the immune system, and balancing T helper pathways, and probably exploiting antiviral effects and everything in between. And I would say just like you just got to think sunlight in the UV range, it's going to build up vitamin D as well. But then also, as I said, with alpha MSH, that within itself is playing like a really big role around like regulating the immune system. So I would say like melanin's probably playing one role, but then the alpha MSH, like the POMC cleavage of alpha MSH through UV light, is arguably playing probably a bigger role, in my opinion. And then obviously you got vitamin D as well, which there's plenty of research where vitamin D within itself is like playing a big role in terms of lowering levels of like long COVID. So yeah, I would say just because of the nature of like when you are getting sunlight, you're not just building melanin, you're doing like another 50 plus things. Arguably it could be the 50 plus things on top of the melanin that are playing such a big fundamental role. But, and I would say like they're all are just like synergizing together in such a positive fashion, provided like someone's like being sensible with their sunlight and not going over the top as well. But yeah, I would say like more so the melanin stuff would be more tied to like the energy and the signaling more than anything, and like counteracting oxidative stress. Good question though.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's interesting about all of it too, like with the effects of light on health, is like you mentioned, there's like that huge vitamin D focus, which is probably the primary, most known benefit of sunlight. That's the thing that everyone just tells me they can just take a pill for, so that they don't have to go outside for more than like 10 minutes. But there's so many more things that happen. I need to find the study so I can put it in the show notes, but there was a study on MS where they were showing improvements with full spectrum sunlight and MS related symptoms, but not the same effect when supplementing with supplemental vitamin D. And so what they were trying to extrapolate from that and needed further study on was like, is the actual benefit from raising baseline vitamin D level, or is the benefit actually from some other inputs from light? And like you said, it's probably a little bit of the vitamin D for sure, because we know how important it is just for the innate immune system in general, but it's probably also these like 50,000 other things that are going on in cell signaling just from being in an appropriate environment. And so that's why like ultimately everything just goes back to some degree that space. One of the things I think about with melanin as well, and just full spectrum light in general, is mold. That's like a really big discussion point over the last year or so. And alpha MSH is intrinsically tied with mold exposure. So a lot of people with mold exposure have dramatically low alpha MSH when you measure it. And so one thing that no one liked to answer when I was in shoemaker like sort of training stuff, I asked, well, like alpha MSH is intrinsically tied with like UVB, UV exposure. And no one wanted to talk about that. They just wanted to talk about the no one really wanted to talk about that when I was in there. They just wanted to talk about like the protocol. It was really weird. But I knew that there had to be a bigger thing, because with my own mold exposure past and heavy metal issues, one of the things that I reflected on was the fact that I never was outside. I strictly avoided any amount of light, wore tons of sunscreen, wore tons of clothes, because of my job at the time. They didn't want me having a tan at all. So I strictly avoided any sort of natural light exposure at all. And so it makes me wonder. No, I didn't have any tan at all for a couple of years. And so it makes me wonder, like, not just what the catalyst moment for a disease state is, but the steps that led up to that. And so that's why I'm more interested in those steps than I am necessarily in the catalyst, because what sets up the system is similar, like with a GI, what sets up the system for an overgrowth, for example. But for people that are interested in improving the state of their melanin, exterior and interior, beyond just getting full spectrum light, including UVA, UVB, what other things are important to take into consideration, do you think, for building melanin?
Yeah. So, and I just wanted to touch on that mole thing, because I just find that like kind of cult-like, isn't it? Where
it was the strangest thing ever. I like to tell people that story, because I get a lot of people with mold backgrounds, and I'll always tell them that.
Yeah, that's just crazy to me. Wow. We got to touch on that.
Oh, did we lose Jack for a second?
Oh, there we go.
He's frozen.
Is that me?
Oh, no. Your face is... There you are.
There we go.
Back.
Hey, guys. Sorry.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. I just thought it was pretty wild to hear that. And it just goes to show that, like, the cults don't just end at, like, just centralized medicine. It goes right into functional medicine. And, yeah, you raised a really valid point in terms of, like, what's going on here. And there's just no discussion around it. I just think it's just crazy in my eyes. Just for the fact that, yeah, you got to think, like, the alpha MSH being low in like 95% of people with mold toxicity, you got to think, well, and again, like they like using peptides. I know that like that protocol likes using like peptides.
Yeah.
But then you got to think, is the alpha MSH just like a proxy of sunlight and POMC cleavage, as opposed to like kind of like the vitamin D, right? Where you see vitamin D high on a blood test and it's like, yeah, cool, we got high vitamin D, that's great. But it almost acts as like a proxy as well of like how much sunlight you're getting and how much you're actually making, which, for POMC, but also for vitamin D, I think, yeah, it's just interesting that it's just been dismissed like that. But yeah, I suppose like to build melanin beyond just like UVA and UVB light, I would say like the first thing is sunrise is really important, because mitochondria play a really big role in terms of the communication around inducing melanogenesis, just because of the nature of how they regulate biophoton emissions and also reduction of oxygen. And there's also a peptide that gets released by mitochondria. It's from a paper called Mitochondria Give Cells a Tan, and they release something called melanogenin. Yeah, you may have seen that paper around. So that is like one of the major peptides that helps upregulate melanogenesis. And then I suppose like the things to actually the other things to increase melanin would be, so the sunrise is obviously important to turn on the mitochondria properly. Anything that compromises mitochondrial function, based off everything we said before, any sort of stress of any kind, any sort of bottlenecks, that's going to play a really big role in terms of probably compromising what's going on. And then, yeah, I would say like the actual backbone of melanin is either phenylalanine or tyrosine. So we need those in our diet, and they're predominantly going to be in animal foods for the most part. We need the BH4, which is like a really important cofactor to turn phenylalanine into tyrosine. And then we need tyrosinase, which is actually found in vitamin C, rich like whole food vitamin C, like the actual enzyme itself. So it kind of makes sense, right? Where like, you know, being in the tropics, you're eating probably like a more high abundance of fruit. Arguably, there's still like, you know, vitamin C amounts are probably relative to other latitudes, but arguably you should be, in my opinion, eating more fruit at these latitudes. So you're probably getting in like this abundance of tyrosinase directly. So yeah, and then I would say the other thing is like POMC gets cleaved into other products, which I didn't mention earlier, but it gets cleaved into alpha MSH, beta endorphin, beta lipotropin, gamma and beta MSH, and then ACTH, and then CLIP. So ACTH and CLIP are more so tied to cortisol and insulin, which again isn't bad. It's what we want in the morning. Not so much like at any other time, because that will just cause huge spikes in blood glucose without eating food, and also spikes in insulin without eating food. And what we need to do is we need to ensure that that cleavage occurs cleanly towards alpha MSH. So I would argue, even if someone's out in sunlight and they're doing all the right things, if they're like neurotic or chronically stressed or anything in between, their POMC cleavage is probably off towards like just stress and cortisol production, despite being out in sunlight. I would say like that would be something that's definitely going on as well. So yeah, and then there's other steps required like to make melanin, but arguably, I would say the biggest factor is the level of stress that someone has in their environment, and that's just like encompasses absolutely everything. That the more stress you have, the less melanin you make, basically, or the more melanin you degrade and the less you make.
That makes a lot of sense. I love it. This might be my ADHD symptoms kicking in, but melanin. So there must be like obviously with the skin, that's where you see it. So I would imagine that if you have something like a skin issue, right? And this might not just be melanin, but would it be pretty fair to say that if you see like acne or aging or seborrheic dermatitis, they can often like infer that there is internal mitochondrial issues going on, things like redox issues, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, the skin within itself, like all three layers of it, arguably the first two layers, they're very energy demanding, and they're also exposed to kind of like the gut. They're exposed to a lot of the external environment. It's very much like an interface. So, and even just with the skin, you just see the nature of how it turns over so quickly. So that's very energy dependent, and it needs to be clean and precise. And when I say energy, obviously I'm talking mitochondria here, but I would say like there's probably, again, like on the biophysical level around like fascia, collagen on like directly on the skin, and the melanin as well. And that's why, you know, sunlight helps essentially build up all of those. And yeah, like around your question, did you say like, were you asking about like, is it linked to mitochondrial dysfunction? Is that what your question was?
Yeah. What I was getting at is that like acne, seborrheic dermatitis, psoriasis, we know that they all have different origins, different physiological reasons why they happen. Would you say that mitochondrial dysfunction in a way is kind of like one of the primary drivers of a lot of this?
Yeah, I would say like it would be tied to, yeah, definitely energy from the mitochondria. You kind of think of it like bacteria are playing a really big role here. So obviously bacteria being mitochondria, but also I would say like anything in the gut and skin microbiome as well has a really big plays really big role in terms of shifting what goes on from the immune system standpoint of like the pathology of those diseases. Absolutely. So yeah, and I even read research recently where hypoxia will shift. So HIF1 alpha will shift metabolic states of immune cells, like lymphocytes, in this case, specifically T cells, towards Th17. And if there's no hypoxia, it shifts it towards more Treg. So, and
Wow, that's
Tregs,
fascinating.
yeah, for those who don't know, like Tregs are essentially like the brakes on the immune pathways. You don't want too much of it. You don't want too little.
Yeah.
And what happens is, like, I would say like the biggest factor that drives autoimmunity is like this dysregulation in those TH pathways. And I would say, arguably they're obviously like playing a really big role responding to like antigens found on certain antigen presenting cells in the immune system and everything else in between. But I would say like still there's just like this huge reliance on how energy is regulated. And I suppose like the thing is, right, it's like we can think about like energy metabolism in immune cells, but then we have to think, how did the infection get there in the first place? And I would say like that's probably tied to what goes in the skin, like the actual function, like because mitochondria are found within keratinocytes, Langerhans cells, fibroblasts, melanocytes, sebocytes. So like there's this whole system, like there's all these workers of these cells working together coherently, provided they have enough energy. You can kind of think of it as like a factory line where like there's people doing certain things, and if someone is a bit sluggish, then the whole thing backs up where like they're on a conveyor belt or something, and it all just starts to build up and build up and build up. And I think that's where like the dysregulation starts to truly kick in. And obviously when that happens, the integrity of, it could be the gut in this case, but it also could just be like the actual epidermis becomes like the stratum corneum predominantly, and then anything that sort of falls behind that is going to be compromised. And what you see is like this susceptibility to infection, exposure to toxins, and then at the same time, you're losing like that integrity of the barrier filled with like lipids and water that essentially, allow for the control of what comes in and what comes out. And I think that's what you see, arguably in like these sort of infections where if it's predominantly coming from the skin, I imagine that's what's going on. Obviously, like with mitochondrial dysfunction, you're usually going to see like it's not just like, again, there's probably like certain defects in certain areas, but usually it's like a systemic thing. So yeah, I would say the overwhelming factor would be probably like the gut microbiome. But again, like that still is the exact same principles, isn't it? Right? Like you guys know all about that in terms of like how Panna cells regulate like the gut lining, and antimicrobial have release antimicrobial peptides. You got goblet cells and all that, and it's all very much energy dependent. And I think like once the integrity drops, obviously that's where you see the susceptibility to infection occur, and that's where we start to see like skin conditions and everything else that's kind of associated with that, which is basically everything really.
Yeah. The way that I like to think about it is if you have a bunch of dominoes, it makes a lot more sense to knock the top domino that's going to knock everything else down, rather than knocking like the second or the third to the last domino. So yeah, maybe you can do like just a good old gut protocol with no light exposure, no optimization of the sleep, no circadian stuff, but in my mind, you're going to be knocking down that top domino. If you're taking care of things like your mitochondrial health, then you're actually fixing what may have contributed to things like a bad microbiome, a bad mucosal layer in the first place. Now, one thing that I wanted to touch on that you said earlier was you reframed certain symptoms, like whether it's fatigue, maybe something dysfunctional in the body, like insulin resistance or whatever it may be, hypoxia, blah, 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 as the body protecting itself under stress. What would you say in our modern human environment would be like probably the most common examples of that you see?
I would say like insulin resistance is probably a good one from like the metabolic side of things, where the insulin is getting released from pancreatic cells, and that's going to be predominantly ATP dependent, but there's a few other pathways in between. But so you're not just responding to glucose there, you're responding to just like energy status within that, and that come from an influx of food. And obviously like we don't need the mitochondria directly for that, because glucose can just go through glycolysis and make ATP that way as well. But when we think about glucose actually being circulated in the blood and then getting fed into like muscle cells or into the brain or whatever it is, probably less so the brain because it's less reliant on insulin. But what we see is like that's probably a really good example that like insulin being elevated is a sign, and same for like leptin as well in this case, is a sign that like we have energy in abundance but we can't use it. And that's obviously going to be directly related to everything I mentioned before around like mitochondrial function and like the integrity of that system, that the cells are independently saying through other mechanisms, through like oxidative stress, predominantly like hydrogen peroxide and other signals, that we don't want this. us individually, even though like the pancreas is saying, okay, we need more insulin into our like secreted into our body, into our blood to allow for glucose uptake based off like responding to elevations in blood glucose, but also just like to the ATP in the beta cells. The cells are independently rejecting the insulin because our energy abundance is so high that we cannot actually make energy properly, and we're making excessive exhaust, and it's protecting itself. And obviously you see that systemically. It's not just like one cell that wants to do that. There's usually like other cells that, no, many other cells that are doing the exact same thing. And hence why you see like insulin elevated as like a protective, well, not as a protective mechanism, but it reflects that like the cells are trying to protect themselves from metabolic stress that they cannot handle.
Yeah.
So I'd say like that's a good one. I mentioned the sleep apnea, which is another good one. I'd say that's
Yeah.
more like less so a symptom, but more so like a condition.
What about obesity? I
Yeah, I would
feel
say
that before like 1920, right? Like if somebody was obese, that was a total anomaly in society. And now it's just a regular thing for people to be obese.
yeah, I would say like the obesity is also, yeah, that's huge as well. We've got this chicken here again, but so, sorry. So like with obesity, like, and just putting on weight, where you got to think that what is essentially found in an adipocyte, it's like triglycerides. And why do we store fat as opposed to glucose and glycogen? Because glycogen is obviously found in more scarcity compared to um, triglycerides. And I would say that because triglycerides can be stored really easily, they don't need to be, they're hydrophobic, so they can be stored and packed really tightly in certain like fat cells, adipocytes. And the more that you actually build up those fat stores, the more it reflects that, okay, we have all this energy that we cannot use, and this is our body trying to protect us again. So obviously this is where like the whole using retatrutide or Ozempic, right? I forgot what the Ozempic's called, but the using those
Manjaro
is
is another one.
yeah. So like all these,
Retatrutide, got them all.
yeah, there's all these crazy ones coming out, and you got to think like the body's doing that for a reason. Maybe it's tied to toxins as well, because we can store toxins in our fat tissue.
Right.
But I would say like the point that it becomes like an issue, obviously like excess weight is problematic, but I think it becomes to the level where like you actually have this inability to, because I would say like that within itself, like storing fat is still like energy intensive, because there's a lot of remodeling of the extracellular matrix. Got to a blood, like you actually got to induce angiogenesis for like all the blood vessels to essentially circulate, so you can extract that hopefully at a later date. But I say like once that kind of becomes exceeded, that's where you start seeing like huge problems of like triglycerides being elevated in the blood, again like blood glucose being elevated, and high blood pressure and everything, like cholesterol being raised in like in a negative fashion. I think that's where you start seeing all of these like really big problems. But yeah, ultimately, like when you think about it, obesity and like just gaining fat in general is a protective mechanism. And I would say like it's an adaptation to our environment in terms of when we're in the summer months and arguably the fall as well, we probably have this abundance of food. And I would say that like in the winter, obviously it's more tied to scarcity, probably longer fasts and like less food in general. Then you think that like the fat gaining at those times is like an adaptation. And obviously it's just being, again, exacerbated in the modern world, kind of like the whole dopamine thing as well, where, as I said before, like we've said that dopamine is like a natural reinforcing mechanism to positive things like, sex, like making a baby, creating life, hunting, finding water, socializing. But it's just been the bar has been set so high that it's just become exacerbated, and like I can't think of the word here, but
You could say in a way they're trying to take away what makes us human.
yes, yeah, absolutely. It's just it's something that they've said like it can be capitalized on as like a disease, but it's really like an adaptation to our biology that is absolutely fundamental. But it just becomes like, yeah, as I said, like just hugely exacerbated in the modern world, where it comes to the point where it's not like a healthy adaptation basically. And that's essentially what we see with like fat tissue, well, fat accumulation as well.
This makes a lot of sense. Just want to say this was absolutely incredible, and you absolutely cooked. There's no doubt about it. But for those listening, there are like many cases throughout history, many such cases of people where they'll go and listen to a podcast and maybe they take it a little too seriously, they get a little neurotic, and next thing you know, they're leaving all of their friends and families to move away from EMFs. So, what would you say for anybody that's just trying to optimize their health holistically, going into their journey in terms of like doing it, but without paralysis by analysis?
Yeah. So interesting you brought this up because, like, for me, like, I'm living on an island right now, like, and it's probably not like ridiculously isolated, but there's some sort of isolation here. And I went to a city like a week ago now, and I felt like overwhelmingly better in that city compared to where I was. And I did like EMF tests and everything. So, I'd say you can still thrive in a city. And honestly, like, it's actually made me come to the point or the conclusion that, like, discussing with my girlfriend, that we might even move back there. So, like, I think there's just like a lot more, obviously, like, what you take, like what you read and what you analyze and what you kind of have your tunnel vision towards, it's just going to be the main thing that you like lives rent free in your brain. And that within itself makes you think differently about like what is healthy and what isn't, and what matters and what doesn't. And I would say, like, probably good examples here is the people in the non-native EMF crowd, where I think you sort of provided the example, but like, they're so neurotic that they think that the only thing that matters is that if there's radio waves in their fucking environment or not. It's insane, and not everything else gets completely neglected. Where there's literally so many pieces of the puzzle required for health. And I mean, ultimately, like, it still comes down to like how oxygen gets reduced. And, there's no denying that non-native EMFs play a big role around that. But then, there's psychological stress, psychosocial stress, financial stress, metabolic stress, nutrient stress, environmental stress. Like, there's so many things that sort of compound to compromise someone's health. And I just think that, just on that topic, I just don't think they're any different to what a fucking vegan is, to tell you the truth, or like a carnivore who is just stuck in their ways. And, like, their brain is just like molded in that sense that they can't think outside the box in terms of what they're doing. And again, it's like compromising their health more than what it could be, in terms of like they could be doing so much more and just, actually living a normal life. And that's applicable to anyone. But anyway, so just on that point, like, I'd say that you can thrive anywhere. You don't have to live, in the tropics like myself. You can live in a city. You just have to be like tactical about it. Like, I still think like there is pockets where like EMFs are low, as an example, but then, to the extent of like how much that plays a big role, I actually don't really know. Like, obviously they do, but I would say like there's other things that are equally as important, such as like socializing. I'd say social isolation is a huge burden. So, connection and like with loved ones, friends, family, just like-minded people, I think is really important. So if you're doing that when you're in a city, I think that's like such a big
It's
thing.
huge. I just
Yeah.
read a study and they found lower long-term IL-6 in those
Mhm.
that had solid social connections. So like it goes to show how important it is to actually just have like a good tribe and a good environment around you.
100%. Then I would say just like the things that I've noticed that are just huge benefit is just walking as much as you can. So
Mhm.
if you're going to live in a city where it's just all walkable. And then
Yeah.
at the same time, when you're walking, obviously wear as little clothes as you can, whether that's like getting cold or getting some sun, wearing some earth runners so you're grounding. I don't really buy into like, don't worry, like, with the EMFs and the ground. I just still think like grounding is better than not grounding, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
Um, and then I suppose it's just like, I'd say the biggest thing around nutrition is just like get on Chronometer, track like 3 to 5 days, see where your
Yeah,
bottlenecks
dude.
are, and
Oh
just,
man.
yeah, and just like justify a supplement if you need to, or just opt for a functional food. And then I suppose like other things is just, beyond just walking, but doing movement that you enjoy. I think that's really important. Maybe doing like a sport, even doing like your workouts outside. I would say the best thing about cities is there's like pull-up bars and dip bars everywhere. So you could just go to the park, take your top off, and just do a workout there with your feet on the earth.
Mhm.
And I think it's amazing. Um, yeah, and I suppose ultimately it's just, if you live in an apartment or something, just create like an environment that is like a haven, like your bedroom is like a haven. So have plants in there, have like block out blinds, have like really good quality like mattress and pillows. Maybe it's like a really good quality silk or something, where you're just having like the best things in there to help enhance your sleep, despite being in a city, as an example. Yeah, and I suppose it's just like getting regular blood work, seeing what's going on with it, reverse engineer anything. And again, like I think that's just such a low hanging fruit, just to get like a blood biochemistry panel and get someone to interpret it. Otherwise, for more specifics, doing like deeper labs, like an organic acids test or a stool test if that's necessary. And yeah, I suppose like the other things would just be anything around stress management. And ultimately, I think it always comes back to the people that seem to live the longest, and they're, arguably not doing everything right, but they're living up well into their 90s, is they just be happy, and they, that's the most important thing.
I literally told a client that today. I was like, look at Dick Van Dyke. That guy is singing every morning. He is the happiest guy on earth, and he's 100. Sometimes simplicity is pays the most dividends, honestly.
Yeah, I think simplicity is huge. Like that's something that I've been doing probably like the last few weeks, just especially around like the technology stuff. I've just been minimizing as much tech use as I can, and just simplifying my life as much as possible, where I'm just with my thoughts more. I'm not multitasking ever anymore. Like I'm just doing one thing, like it's going for a walk, not listening to anything, not listening to music whilst I work. Like I'm really trying to like just simplify a lot of stuff. And I think that can be really powerful. And then I would just say,
yes. Yeah, your brain, when it goes like switching between surface level tasks all the time, there is honestly like nothing more effective that will deplete your mental energy than when you're hopping back and forth between your emails and WhatsApp and something else. Very important to do what Jack just mentioned, which is just going on like a nice walk and getting out into nature, and ultimately allowing your human consciousness and your thoughts to come to the forefront, so that you can become a human again and start thinking critically and doing on these things and then acting on certain things. And next thing you know, your life has changed.
Yeah, well, I literally just bought an iPad just to take notes, because I just think laptops are a trap, to be honest with you. I've sort of come to the conclusion where I would just get constantly distracted, especially when you do like the expose on like a Mac, where like you see all your windows, and then it's just, that is within itself is so overwhelming. I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to buy an iPad. What's that?
Don't look at my tabs.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing. I had a huge, that was a huge thing of me, is like I would have like 50 tabs, like 2 windows open, and then I just don't think that's even good for the system. So yeah, it is very much simplifying and trying to, this is more so like productivity stuff, but just I say like the biggest thing around productivity is like disqualifying things that you don't need to do right now, and you don't need to learn. And that within itself, like it shouldn't feel good to do that. And that means this is a good thing, because you're getting rid of like all this noise that you don't need. So yeah, and I would just say like the last point is just like around like you can justify like if you can justify like a biohack, then do it, in terms of like, circling back to the question we said before, where like using, if like light is a bit of a struggle, I'm not opposed to like using like UV light panels, whether it's a Spurdy or a Chroma, running those things on top, doing a bit of cold exposure, running some nootropics. Yeah, exactly. So, you can leverage those things. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. But yeah, obviously it's never going to replace what nature gives you, but it can be useful. So yeah.
Of course. Well, Jack, thank you so much for coming on. Like, it was such an honor, genuinely. Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks guys. It was a pleasure talking to you both as well. You're both a wealth of knowledge and asked some really awesome questions. I think we went pretty deep, to be honest.
I think so
too. Wasn't expecting to go this deep, but it was good. You had to refresh me on my melanin stuff. Yeah, so the main place you can find me, I mean, like I got social media platforms. So I got Instagram, which is Jack Schroder _. Then I've got X, which is Jack _Schroder _. Then my website's jackschroder.com. You can find like links to work with me, and like for customized protocols, and then also for my school community, which is something that I would encourage almost everyone to join, to be honest with you, because it touches on like these topics, but like very in depth and very broad spectrum, and has like over 100 protocols in there, like 70 plus webinars, and then like weekly calls as well. And I think like the beauty of it is that people who can't afford my one-to-one services, whether that's a protocol or just like a one-off consult, or like a long-term one, like a 6 or 12 month mentorship or health program, is that you can just go in there for a fraction of the price, post your labs, post your symptoms, post what's going on. If you have any questions, you can obviously ask. And I respond every 24 hours, and I'm getting some really good progress in there. Like there's people who are literally like resolving their gut issues just from like me messaging back and forth a few times. So
Legendary.
I would encourage people. Yeah, it's catered to people who want to, who are very, probably arguably been like jump through a lot of hoops around like their health stuff, and they probably know a little bit of the terminology by now. It's perfect for them. It's also perfect for practitioners who want to just like dive really deep and learn a bunch of interesting stuff around biology and lab work and the quantum stuff that we spoke about. It has everything in there. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone kind of doing something like this in the health space like me in terms of like the 24-hour support. So I would say like it's a really good opportunity for anyone who wants to join.
As somebody who is in Jack's community, I'm not joking, it is one of the best out there. If you're somebody that just wants good information, and you're just like done with seeing like all of the conflicting sources of information on the internet, and you just want to hear like the true nuance and to get to the bottom of everything, Jack's community is absolutely amazing for that, and it's one of the best educational communities on the internet that I've seen for health, and just in terms of like application and that sort of thing too. So I would strongly recommend it to anybody listening, and for all of you listening, thank you so much for tuning in.